Welcome to part 3 of the THABO Bester Saga series. Now we are looking at the role of assurance with regards to this matter. So assurance is basically the division responsible for providing assurance on the achievement of the company's objectives, which in this case we're going to focus on internal audit. So internal audit provides assurance on whether the company's objectives are being achieved or not, right? So it means they need to assess. So the biggest question is, did the internal audit division do its work at the required level of competence and professional care? So we break it down. Number one, did they report the control inadequacy for emergency evacuation? Because you might have learned that there were no proper controls in place regarding safety as well as emergency evacuation, right? Now let's look at the for example, there was no fire sprinkler to sprinkle the fire. Number one. Number two, there was no fire detector to detect the fire so that everyone can be evacuated immediately, right? There was no such, right? Now you ask yourself a question: did anywhere in the internal audit report did they report about that, right? So if they did not, then it means the internal audit has failed, right? Number two, you look at the um, reports again. Did they report any control inadequacy concerning the risk of escape? Because as we discussed before, um, the controls for the risk of escape in the risk register could have been inadequate, right? Because if you look at the events that led to the success of this escape, you find that the controls were weaker. It's either they were not sufficient or they were weak, right? Now, if the controls were there, they were sufficient, then it means that they were not working as intended. But I'm interested to know whether the controls that are there for the risk of escape are sufficient, right? If not, you must find it in somewhere in the internal audit reports where the internal audit report the internal audit division reports that the controls regarding the risk of escape are inadequate, right? Now let's also look at the control weaknesses on security management. Did they report any weakness on the security management? Because the security points are weak. Firstly, a vehicle was allowed into the premises without being searched, right? Now, it's an indication of a weak security management system, right? Number two, during the escape, number two, the CCTVs were not functional during that period. Yeah, right? Now, number three, that's another feature of a weak security management. Number three, during the escape, when the inmate is escaping, he will probably go through security key points within the facility. Now, he passed all those security key points without being detected or without being stopped. Now, that's another feature of a weak security management. As much as the escape was planned, but there must be systems to detect any management override of controls, because you can see that there was an override of controls. But what systems are there? What security systems are there to ensure that any override of security management controls is being detected and reported. There was none, obviously, because the escape was successful. Now, let's also look at the investigation. Now, in terms of the investigation, after the alleged suicide, the internal investigators had carried out an investigation. You ask yourself, did they highlight any red flags for possible escape? Because if there is an event and you go and investigate that event, but then you realize that there are security breaches within that process, then as an auditor, you will flag you will flag those indicators, because there is an indication of a possible concealment. Right now, you will flag it and then you report it to authorities. So we ask ourselves, did they highlight any red flags for that event? Or they did, but it was ignored by the higher authorities, such as the board or the risk manage or the audit committee, whoever the internal audit division reports to. You ask yourself that question. Now, you also ask yourself, did they find any red flags? Because it's one thing to report red flags, it's one thing to find it and ignore or conceal. If you ignore, it's another problem. If you conceal, it's another problem. If you don't find it, it's another problem. So we are interested to know whether they found any red flags, reported any red flags, or concealed or ignored the red flags, right? So the internal audit report will tell you that information. Now let's go back, because if you remember on the first part, when I discussed the enablers of the escape, I said another problem that led to the success of this escape is that the person who is responsible for audit is also responsible for risk. So it means if risk management has failed to do certain work, then internal audit will also not report that information, because the person who is responsible for reporting internal audit matters is also responsible for reporting risk matters. So you cannot report yourself, because if risk has failed, it means you have failed, and internal audit has succeeded, then you can't report yourself. So there's a huge conflict here when the division for risk management is managed by the same person who is also managing internal audit. There is a big problem, because you cannot report yourself. For example, if some of the internal audit findings find that there was a failure in the risk register, there were no adequate controls, then you can't report yourself on that. So there's so much to say about this, but I'm just gonna stop here, and let's just look at the benchmark which I'm using to criticize internal audit. So according to the standards, international standards for the professional practice of internal auditing, internal auditors must conduct risk-based audits. So it means they must use the risk register. They must also evaluate controls, risk management, and governance processes. If any of those are failing, then internal audit must not fail in telling them that they are failing. Now, the other one is they must exercise competence and due professional care, which means they must never ignore anything. They must not take anything for granted, and they must be committed in their work. Lastly, they must be skilled and cautious of irregularities, which means they must be able to identify red flags. They must be skeptical of everything. Okay, lastly, let's look at the work of the Parliamentary Portfolio Committee on Justice and Correctional Services. So I was particularly impressed with the line of probing and line of questioning, and they visited the center and held everyone accountable. So well done to them. And this brings us to the end of our series. Please subscribe, comment, and share. Thank you.